Well, I bet you couldn't wait to hear what the third thing we do with GDP is. So, without any further ado, let's get right to it. GDP is also used as a way to evaluate where we are in the business cycle. Now, to understand business cycles, we have to understand a little bit more about what's going on when we look at the macroeconomy in terms of time frame. Here's a chart of GDP over time for the United States, going way back to the mid 1910s. And what this graph shows you is what we talk about, or what we mean when we talk about a business cycle. Notice that there are ups and downs as GDP moves across time. So here in the early 1910s, we have a clear upward movement, and then there's a drop. And there's another upward movement, and then there's another drop, and another up, and another down, and then the roaring 20s come along, and things are looking great, and then, oh no, here comes the Great Depression. There it goes. GDP drops down to below what it was even in the early 1910s, and then things start to pick up a little bit, and in the mid 1930s there's another drop, and then things start to look like they're picking up in the late 1930s, and boom, things go down again. And here we are into the early 1940s, and the war begins, and then we start to have this upward tick, and we see these ups and downs throughout time. When we're talking about business cycles, what we're really talking about are those ups and downs. The business cycle is a way of looking at the short run, and that's one of the time frames within macroeconomics that we need to be concerned about. What's going on in the short run? Now, there's no predetermined time that says this is the short run. It's not 6 months or a year necessarily, but the rule of thumb is generally within 3 years. And we see these ups and downs occur, and that's just normal. It's just part of the macroeconomy. But the long term is a picture of what's going on over time. And if we were to put a trend line into this data over time, what we would see is that things are on their way up. So that blue line that I've just drawn in there, that's a clear indication that the macroeconomy, as measured by GDP, is moving in an upward direction. Now, there are going to be time periods when we're above that trend line, and that's what we see over here. And then there are times where we're below the trend line. That's what we see during the Great Depression. And we see ups and downs all along the way. But over time, we expect to see the economy grow so that we start off in the lower left-hand corner and we move upward to the upper right-hand corner over time. That time period, that trend over time, is what we call the long run. And we'll talk about how we measure the long run and how we try to understand what's going on in the long run next week. But for now, what I want to focus our attention on, at least for the next few minutes, is how we use GDP as a measure of those business cycles. So when we think of business cycles are just the normal ups and downs in the economy. We can kind of draw a stylized view of the business cycle. Let's take a look at what that might look like. To do that, we're going to put it in a space where we're looking at GDP over time. So here's time along our horizontal axis, and here's real GDP on our vertical axis. And a normal kind of smooth business cycle model would look something like this, where we see some very clear ups and very clear downs in the economy. So each business cycle, no matter what it looks like in reality, has 4 components or 4 cycles or 4 phases to the business cycle. Those phases are the peak, the recession, or sometimes this is called a contraction, the trough and then we have the recovery phase, or sometimes this is called the expansion. So those are the 4 phases of the business cycle. And we can see those things clearly displayed in each business cycle. So we would start off here. This is the peak. So I'm just going to put a number 1 there. And then we would go from the peak downwards. You only have one direction to go from the top, and that's down. So our second phase of the business cycle is this area here, anywhere you're on your way down, until you hit the bottom. The bottom is phase 3. And the only good thing about being in phase 3 or at the trough is that you only have one direction to go, and that's back up. So that would be our 4th phase of the business cycle till we get back to another peak. And all business cycles have this progression. You start at a peak, you go into a recession, you hit the trough, and then you have a recovery. Hopefully, though, what we find is that your business cycle has a particular direction to it. If you notice in this, kind of theoretical view of the business cycle, there is a distinct upward trend, so that over time you still have these ups and downs, but everything in terms of real GDP keeps growing and growing as a whole. So when you're into a recession, eventually you're going to go below that trend line. That's what we see here with our trough, and we see that here, and we see that here. But there are times when you're above the trend as well. That's when once you sort of are into your recovery and then you hit your peak, those time periods you should be above the trend. But overall, hopefully what's going on is, even though you have these normal ups and downs, you are moving in a direction that's onward and upward, so that GDP is continuing to grow, even though sometimes it sputters a little bit. Now, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, maybe not, as we're going to talk a little bit about later, this business cycle is considered to be the short run. So the ups and downs of the business cycle, those are short run in nature. The trend, however, is our long run perspective. And we'll get back to these ideas here shortly. But the short run is the business cycle, the ups and downs that we experience. And the long run is, where are we going over time? One of the other things we're going to talk about later are the difficulties that policymakers have in terms of trying to control this business cycle. I mentioned the idea of economic stability being a goal. And what that means is you want this business cycle to be not too radical. So again, here we have a business cycle. Here's our ups and downs. And what you want to do is you want to prevent those ups and downs from looking more like this. These wild ups and downs can be incredibly destabilizing for an economy. Policymakers want to take those peaks and valleys that are just kind of untenable and make them more look like the black business cycle as opposed to the red business cycle. It's not an easy job, and that's one of the things we'll talk about when we get into the policy section of the class. Now that we've gone through the major parts of GDP and the major roles that GDP plays, it's important that we recognize that there are some significant shortcomings with GDP. It is not a perfect statistic, nor was it ever created to be a perfect statistic. It's just there to measure output. But there are lots of things that aren't included in GDP that would increase the measure of productivity and increase the output that we count, but they're just really hard to count. For example, we don't count household production in GDP. I referred to this idea very, very briefly last time. If you go out and pay for services for people to do things for you, whether it's to cut your hair, whether it's to mow the grass, whether it is to cook you a meal, we count that as part of GDP. But if you were to do those things for yourself, so if you were to cook your own food or change the oil in your car on your own or clean the house, if you do those things on your own, those are considered household production and they're not part of GDP. And they're just really hard to count. Can you imagine what life would be like if you had a government worker following you around every day? Try to get an accurate picture of what your level of production is so that GDP could be counted accurately. That would be impossibly intrusive. So we don't count household production. Now this has a very important role to play in countries like Haiti that we talked about last time. In some countries, household production, or what is considered non-market production, is a huge part of what happens in an economy. In Haiti, people do so many things on their own because they don't have any money to pay for other people to do it. So if we were able to count household production, then GDP would be much higher than it actually is. But we can't because it's just too hard to count. A second thing that's not part of GDP is black market activity. Now, black market activity may be illegal, but it may not be illegal. It may be something as simple as paying a neighborhood kid to mow the grass for you, or having, paying somebody to come babysit your kids, or going and buying a dog or a cat from the Amish family down the street. These are things that are not illegal, but they're just done under the radar. Black market activity. It might be something like producing your own hand sanitizer at your house and selling it without reporting it on your taxes. Black market activity isn't part of GDP because it's hard to count. People don't want it to be counted. And so it isn't. Now, in a lot of countries, or in some countries at least, black market activity is a big part of what goes on. But because it's not counted, those countries' GDPs are underreported. Now, we could also be talking about straight up illegal activity. So it might be producing meth in your basement, or contract killings, or any kind of illegal activity, things that you're not supposed to be engaged in because you're breaking the law. That's not counted as GDP either. Of course, if somebody were to knock on your door and you've got a meth lab going, and they ask you, "Are you doing anything productive in here? And what is it?" You're not likely to tell them. Illegal activity is part of economies, however. If we look at a country like Colombia, where there is a lot of drug production, or Afghanistan, where they have an enormous amount of opium production, those are things that are illegal, and so they're not counted in GDP, but that doesn't mean they're not productive activities. Now, there are some other things that aren't counted as part of GDP that are reflections of standard of living. And that's one of the problems with GDP itself, is that sometimes GDP doesn't include things that are actually beneficial to people because we don't have any concept of how to measure them. Things like leisure, and things like quality of life, things like pollution levels. We don't measure happiness or straight up quality of life with GDP. It's a proxy. It's an approximation of how well off people are. But that's not what GDP was designed to do. And when we attribute GDP as an official measure of quality of life, we might be giving GDP more credit than it's due. GDP is just supposed to be measuring output or income. Of course, GDP is also not measuring anything related to happiness. Happiness is something that's incredibly difficult to measure, but the country of Bhutan is trying to come up with a happiness index, something that measures people's satisfaction with their life overall. That is something that will have to be done with a measure other than GDP, because GDP doesn't do that. Now it's time to deal with our final macroeconomic topic. And to do that, we're going to bring in a guest speaker. He's known far and wide as the master of, well, maybe not inflation, but certainly understanding evil inflation.
Here's the plan. We get the warhead and we hold the world ransom for $1 million.
Well, don't you think we should maybe ask for more than $1 million? $1 million isn't exactly a lot of money these days. Virtucon alone makes over $9 billion a year.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot. Okay then. We hold the world ransom for $100 billion.
Oh, Dr. Evil, you just don't get it. Things have changed since you were last on the scene. Prices don't stay the same over time. They tend to increase. In fact, it's not just the price of ransom, it's the price pretty much of everything. Everything tends to get more expensive over time, and that steady, sustained increase in the general price level is what we call inflation. And that's what's going on here. $1 million was a lot of money back in the 60s, but today it's not as much as it used to be. It doesn't go nearly as far. We can think about inflation in two different ways. One way is to think about inflation as the rise in prices. But inflation is also what happens when the value of your money goes down. It's really like two sides of the same coin. Think about it this way. Let's say that you wake up tomorrow. You decide, since you don't have class, you're going to go out and have breakfast at Dunkin' Donuts. So you go out to Dunkin', and before you get out of the car, you look in your wallet and you notice that you have twice as much money as you did the day before. You may say to yourself, whoa, I'm not sure what happened last night, but I'm not going to ask too many questions because I have more money and that makes me happy. Well, you walk into Dunkin' and you say to the person behind the cash register, say, I want a half a dozen donuts. And so you pick out your donuts, they ring you up, and instead of that costing, say, $5, it now costs $10. You think to yourself, well, that's weird. That's twice as much as it cost before. But that doesn't matter to you so much because you have twice as much money. So you also say, you know what, give me a cup of coffee as well. And they pour you a cup of coffee, and instead of the coffee costing $2, it costs $4. You say to yourself, well, that's really weird because yesterday the coffee was $2 and now it's $4. I had twice as much money in my wallet, but things at Dunkin' are twice as expensive. And you get back in your car kind of scratching your head and you go down University Boulevard and you notice that gas prices are twice as much as they were before. In fact, prices have doubled everywhere. But because your income has doubled, it doesn't matter. You have twice as much money, but everything is twice as expensive. If that's the way the world works, it really doesn't matter that you have more money because everything costs more. But if prices were to double and your income had stayed the same, well, then you've got a serious problem because the value of your money is not as high as it was before. Specifically, you can't buy as much as you could before because everything is more expensive and you still have the same dollars in your wallet. That's what inflation is like. In fact, we can take a look at a couple of pictures of what inflation looks like to really drive that point home. Think about what life would be like if you had a money tree. Maybe your parents have told you at some point money doesn't grow on trees, but let's assume that they're wrong about that and that inflation and that money does grow on trees. Well, if money were to grow on trees, we would have just a horrible problem. Think about how valuable the leaves that fall off of a tree are. They're so not valuable that we actually get rid of them in a very efficient way. I mean, they're beautiful. You see a shot like this with the beautiful colors, but when the leaves fall off the tree, then you end up having to rake them up, you put them in a pile, and you burn them. If money grew on trees, then the money would be as common as leaves, which would make them as valuable as leaves. This is one of the problems of inflation, is that there is a diminished value to the thing you are using as a currency, as a medium of exchange. And if it becomes too common, then it becomes essentially worthless, only good to be put on the pile to burn. So having a money tree, that's a bad thing, unless, of course, you have the only money tree, in which case it's not a problem at all. But if everybody has a money tree, then money is as common as leaves, and it's not going to be very valuable. This is one of the things that people in Zimbabwe came to realize when the government of Zimbabwe printed so much money that it became unwieldy to use. So the government started printing larger and larger currency notes to the point where they were printing billion-dollar notes. Unfortunately, there was so many billions of Zimbabwean dollars in the economy that they weren't worth anything. And so you have a picture like this one of these two guys who seem to be fairly happy, holding up their sign that says starving billionaires. And they are billionaires. The problem is that they have billions of dollars of a worthless currency. So even though they have lots of money, they can't buy anything with it because the dollar has lost value. That's inflation. Here's another picture of inflation, a historical picture of inflation. This is somebody who's wallpapering his house with Deutschmarks. You may know the history of interwar Germany. In fact, we referenced this when we talked about John Maynard Keynes last time. Keynes said if you force these countries, Austria and Germany, to repay their war debts, they're just going to print money and it's going to cause massive inflation. To the point that the one Deutschmark note wasn't worth anything. You couldn't buy anything with it, so people used it as wallpaper because it was actually cheaper than using wallpaper. And some people just threw their money into the streets like trash. So you had to pay somebody to come sweep it up because it just wasn't worth anything. It was just garbage. If money doesn't maintain its value because of inflation, that's all the money is good for. Now you may say to yourself, well, these are old pictures. Yeah, Zimbabwe, it's a country that's far away. But here's a picture of, and maybe a poignant picture, considering what's going on with the coronavirus, but this is a picture of a stack of Venezuelan currency. The Venezuelan currency is called the bolivar. Here's a stack of bolivars that represents how much you need to buy a roll of toilet paper. Now keep in mind that the bolivar is made out of paper, and you need a lot of it just to buy a roll of toilet paper, which may make you think, well, how much is that Venezuelan currency really worth if I need that much just to buy a roll of toilet paper? Or this much to buy a pound of tomatoes? Or this much to buy a chicken? If you needed to buy 2 chickens, you're going to need a wheelbarrow to carry that money around because the money is so utterly worthless. You need stacks and stacks and stacks of it just to buy common things. All right, so how do we measure inflation? What's the official inflation statistic? Well, we use something called the Consumer Price Index, or more commonly known as the CPI. This is the official inflation statistic for the United States. It's not a perfect measure, just like GDP wasn't a perfect measure, and just like unemployment isn't really a perfect measure either. The Consumer Price Index looks at the prices that the average urban consumer, the prices of the goods the average urban consumer buys. So we're looking at the things that, most of the stuff that you buy, computers and cell phones and blue jeans and lattes at Starbucks. And what does the average urban consumer buy? If you're not average and you're not urban, then the Consumer Price Index probably doesn't reflect well what you are consuming. But since most people in the country do live in urban or suburban areas, the Consumer Price Index is a pretty good measure of the prices of the goods that we consume. Now, in the Consumer Price Index, we don't have goods for everything. We have prices for 8,000 or so different goods. And we mentioned this when we were looking at unemployment. The Consumer Price Index is computed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There are lots of employees of the Bureau of Labor Statistics whose job it is to go shopping. They go out and shop for goods. They go out and price compare for goods, for these 8,000 goods. And these people every month go out and kind of canvass their areas, looking at prices to see what's going on with prices. Have prices gone up? Have prices gone down? If so, can we figure out why? So to construct the Consumer Price Index, we need to have information on these 8,000 different goods. So the first step really of constructing the CPI is we need to determine what goes in the basket. What determines what goods we're using? And I use that term, the basket, to refer to really what is kind of what contains the goods. I mean, you can think about this as going to the world's biggest Costco and getting the world's largest shopping cart. So here's a shopping cart. Oh, it's not too bad. So there's your shopping cart. And what you're doing is you're taking a walk down the aisles of the world's largest Costco, and you're throwing things in the shopping cart. You get one of everything that you need, one of 8,000 different goods. And of course, if you do that, that's going to build up the shopping cart. There's going to be lots of stuff in that shopping cart. And so here you have a whole bunch of stuff in the shopping cart. It's just all piled up here. And you go and you check out, and the cashier, of course, is like, oh man, this is the worst customer ever. But they ring you up and they give you a receipt. And that receipt is not in dollar terms. It's actually a 3-digit number with a couple of numbers past the decimal point. And really, that's what the CPI is. So the first thing we do is we determine what's in the basket. The second thing is we have to get the prices of those goods that are in the basket. And that's what you've done by checking out. And then we compute the index. And to do that, what you do is you take the price of the goods, you take that receipt. So you take the price of the goods today, and you divide it by the price of those same goods at some point in the past. That point in the past is something we call a base year. So really what we're doing is we're comparing what's my receipt from these goods today versus the receipt that I got maybe 10 years ago. We multiply that by 100 and we get a number. The number is the Consumer Price Index. So what's today's Consumer Price Index? Well, to get today's Consumer Price Index, we need to go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics webpage. So here we are back at the Bureau of Labor Statistics webpage, and instead of clicking on the unemployment rate, we're going to click on Consumer Price Index. We'll take a look here at the first table, and that first table tells us what the consumer price indexes are. So what we're looking at, and what we want to look at, is this number here. Well, specifically this number here for February of 2020. The Consumer Price Index is 258.673. Now, we don't know what that means unless we have some context. We need to know what we're comparing this to. If we were to compare this to the price index in January, we would see that in January it was 257.971. All that information tells us is that prices were higher in February than they were in January. I know that because the number in February, this number here, is bigger than this number right here. So what the CPI tells us is, first of all, are prices higher than they were before? If the number from one month to the next goes up, then we have inflation. Now sometimes the number goes down, and if the number goes down, we have what's called deflation. Now what we're doing here is we're looking at just this one category, all items, everything. So that would include food, that would include energy, that would include shelter, medical services, transportation, everything that we buy, at least that's counted in the CPI. Now this particular table does some splitting out of things because energy prices tend to be a little bit more, they change a little bit more often. Food prices can change a little bit more often. So then they report a number, all items except for food and energy. But what we're really interested in, and for our purposes here, is this all items number. And since it's gone from January to February, the number's gone up, we have inflation. We also have the opportunity to compare this from where we were last year at this time. So in February, at the end of February in 2019, the index was 252 and change, and now it's 258 and change. So we can tell what's happened in terms of the inflation. We know that prices have gone up, but one of the other things we want to know is how quickly they have gone up. What's the rate of change? Because if the prices go up, but they just go up a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. But if it goes up a lot in a short period of time, then that can be very destabilizing. So let's take a look at our GDP in terms of a rate, or our CPI in terms of a rate of change. So here we are using the same formula that we used for GDP growth, but now we're looking at this in terms of CPI. We're going to take the CPI 2, which is the newer CPI, minus CPI 1, which is the older CPI, divide that difference by the old CPI and multiply it by 100, and that's going to tell us the inflation rate, just like it told us the economic growth rate. So let's put some of those numbers from our from what we just saw from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Let's put those numbers into our equation here. All right. So what we're going to look at is the change between January and February. So here we'll put 258.678 minus the January number, which is 257.971. Divide that by 257.971, and eventually we'll get over there to multiply it by 100. So I'm going to use my calculator here. 258.678 minus 257.971 gives me 0.707 divided by 257.971. And that gives me 0.0027. And if I multiply that by 100, I get an inflation rate of 0.27. So 0.27 should be my inflation number. And if I look at the information that is presented to me by the BLS, if I look at the January to February 2020, I see that they have a 0.3, so they've rounded up. Now you may think to yourself, wait a minute, I thought inflation was 0.1. Where's this 0.27 or this 0.3 coming from? And if we go across our table, we see that January to February 2020 is actually listed two different ways, 0.3 and 0.1. What's going on? Well, there are two different reports here. One is the unadjusted percent change. That's what we calculated. And the other is what's called the seasonally adjusted percent change. Because of the way we calculate CPI, and because of what goes into CPI, there are some different, there are some problems with the number. So before we leave CPI, we need to talk about what some of those problems are. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has some methods that they use to adjust for these problems. And so they report two different numbers. They report the unadjusted number, which is what we calculated, and they also report this adjusted number of 0.1. So let's take a look at some of the problems that are created with using this CPI. So the first problem we have is something we call substitution bias. Substitution bias refers to the idea that when people go to the store, they will oftentimes substitute cheaper goods that are decent substitutes for more expensive goods. So because of people's natural inclination to want to buy cheaper things, we see changes in consumption based on lower prices. And that would bias the CPI because now people are making their choices on cheaper goods. So the CPI might actually be undercounted. That's a hard thing to take into consideration. In fact, all of these things we're going to look at are hard things to take into consideration for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so they have to make some adjustments to the numbers. Another problem with counting the CPI deals with changes in quality. Of course, over time, we see that things change. If you were to look at these two pictures of a cell phone, one from the late 1980s and one from the present day, you would look at these two things and say these are not really the same items at all, yet they count for the same in the measurement of CPI. And if the price of one good goes up relative to the other or down relative to the other, reflecting quality, that's going to screw up the measurement of CPI. A third problem that we observe is when we have to introduce new products into the basket. So we have 8,000 or so goods in the basket for CPI, but the goods that we count today are not the same thing as the goods that went into the initial basket of CPI, which was created in 1913. There are so many different things now that we have that we didn't have back then. There's tennis shoes, and there are cell phones, and there are computers, and there are calculators. There are different kinds of transportation, and all of these differences have to be adjusted for, otherwise we can't compare CPI over time. And then, of course, not only do we have to worry about new products, but we have to worry about new places to buy the products. So as we buy more and more things online, that means that the people who are shopping for CPI have to take into consideration these other sources or these other locations of where goods can be acquired. And then, maybe the king of all problems with CPI are things related to seasonal changes. I'm going to leave around 1:30, honey. Seasonal changes reflect the reality that people buy different things during different parts of the year. So you buy a swimsuit in the summertime, not in the wintertime. You buy mittens in the winter, not in the summer. And so those things are part of the basket, but you're not willing to pay for them all year round. So we have to make seasonal adjustments to the CPI. And all of these things just make computing this particular statistic really difficult. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does the best they can to adjust for all of these problems, but they're probably not going to get every single problem that exists. And speaking of problems, there's lots of problems that are part of or a result of having inflation in your economy. There are specifically certain people who are hurt more than others when inflation occurs. One of those groups of people who are hurt by inflation are people who save money. Think about it this way: if you put money in a bank and leave it there, unless you can find some way to be protected against that inflation, when you take money out of the bank, it's not going to be able to buy you as much as it could when you put it in, because it's going to lose value. This became a particularly problematic thing for one of the guys we mentioned a little bit earlier when we started looking at macroeconomics, F.A. Hayek. Hayek's family lived in Austria in that time period between World War I and World War II, where there was massive inflation, just like Keynes had predicted there would be. This massive inflation caused Hayek's family to lose every penny that they saved, because when they took it out of the bank, it wasn't worth anything. Remember that picture of the guy wallpapering his house with his money? That's basically what happened to the Hayek family. Their money was so worthless because of inflation. And that led Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics to look at inflation as the great evil of macroeconomics, the thing that had to be dealt with to the extent of anything else. Inflation can really hurt this group of people, savers. But inflation can also hurt other people. If you're a lender, if you lend money and there is inflation, it means that the money that's being repaid to you by the borrower will be worth less than when you lent the money in the first place. And as we're going to talk about in one of the next couple of lectures, this discourages lending. And if you discourage lending, that's going to discourage investment. And if you discourage investment, that means you're not going to have much by way of economic growth. So lenders really don't like inflation. Another group of people who don't like inflation are people who live on fixed incomes. These tend to be older people, retirees, who get a certain amount of money every month, But if that money doesn't change, if that income doesn't change and prices go up, then their money loses purchasing power, and they can go from an economic status where they were doing just fine to basically being impoverished. Now, one thing about this inflation and the way that it hurts people is that it only hurts people if it's unexpected. Expected inflation can be dealt with, but unexpected inflation, that's where we run into some significant problems for people. Because unexpected inflation leads to uncertainty. Uncertainty about what you should do in terms of saving, uncertainty regarding what you do if you're a business and you're trying to set long-term contracts. Those long-term contracts are needed for investment and production, and they're seen as more risky if there's lots of inflation, especially if inflation is fluctuating wildly. So what are you going to do? How are you going to be able to protect yourself from inflation? Well, one thing that banks do, one thing that lenders do, and borrowers can do this as well, is to pay attention to the interest rate. Now, again, if inflation is unexpected, you might have a problem. But let's assume that for now, it's expected inflation. If you are a lender, you lend money at an interest rate. This is the price people pay to borrow money from you. We call that advertised rate. The nominal interest rate. So you go into a bank, they say, we'll lend money to you at 5% interest. That's the nominal interest rate. But the value of the money that you repay as a borrower, or that is repaid to the lender, the value of that money in terms of its spending power, well, that is going to be determined upon or based upon inflation. So if we take the nominal interest rate and subtract the inflation rate, that gives us the real change in purchasing power, or the real interest rate. We looked at the idea between the difference between nominal and real when we looked at GDP. Real GDP is adjusted for inflation. And here what we're looking at is an interest rate that is adjusted for inflation. So let's say that people expect, or businesses expect, that the inflation rate will be 3% or 2%. This is kind of the standard US inflation rate. So if a bank charges 5, they expect the inflation rate to be 2%, then naturally that just leaves us with a real interest rate of 3%, which means when you repay your money, it's 3% more valuable than it was when you borrowed it. It can buy 3% more in terms of goods. But what happens if inflation is unexpected? So we start off with a 5% interest rate. What happens if, say, inflation is unexpectedly high? Let's say it's 10%. Well, if that's the case, when the bank lends money at 5%, prices go up by 10%. When you repay, the money is actually worth less than when you borrowed it. That's what that negative sign means. So 5% minus unexpectedly high inflation of 10% leads to a real interest rate of minus 5%. So that means the money you repay is worth less. And that's bad for the banks. That's bad for the lender. It's good for the borrower. But if banks need to lend money to help economies grow and they can't keep up with inflation because inflation is fluctuating wildly, they may just stop lending. That's bad. Or what they might do is make some adjustments. If inflation is 10%, what they can do is the bank can change its advertised interest rate. Say it changes it to 15%. So if they increase the nominal interest rate to 15 and inflation stays around 10, now that bank is earning 5% in terms of real purchasing power, in terms of a real rate of return. So if inflation is all over the place, it's really hard for lenders. And it can be hard for borrowers too. If you don't know what the interest rate, if you don't know what the inflation rate is going to be and you agree to a very high nominal interest rate, let's say you agree to a 15% rate, and inflation instead of being 10% is only 3%, well, that means you are repaying money that can buy 12% more things. So if inflation is unexpectedly low, it can hurt the borrower. If it's unexpectedly high, it's going to hurt the lender. All this is designed to say that it's better for an economy if you know what inflation is, if you can predict it fairly accurately. Because if you can't, then the value of money is all over the place, and lending and borrowing and that important process that takes place in the macroeconomy is not going to take place as much as we would like it to. So those are the basic pieces of macroeconomics. GDP measures output, unemployment measures how many people are working, and inflation measures the change in the general price level. What we want to do is we want to have those three pieces kind of behave themselves. We want there to be sustained growth. We want there to be a minimal amount of unemployment, and we want inflation to stay low and very predictable. Pretty much the rest of the class is going to be dealing with how we try to accomplish those objectives through different methods. So now that you know the basics, we're going to take off and see what we can do with those.